evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's lovely to be invited to this lunch today. How to follow that? The book that I've written to Helen Black is hardly a bundle of fun or a barrel of laughs. So we have to say some serious things about it very briefly. When Penguin asked me to write this book quite a number of years ago, that is to write a book which they wanted to be a history of Europe in the 20th century, to go into their series, The Penguin History of Europe. They must have called me at a weak moment, or a moment of madness, because I accepted and agreed to do it. And it was a moment of madness, I think, on my part, because I was inflicting on myself then an immense amount of reading on so many different subjects and aspects of this very dramatic and terrible 20th century in Europe. And my expertise, such as it has been really on Germany. And so, obviously, I had to read an immense amount about many other areas of Europe and many other parts of the histories of those parts of Europe. And it was a very daunting prospect to take on. As I was partway through writing it, Penguin, my publisher, then asked me would I make it 2 volumes. It seemed always to be my fate to have to write 2 volumes, as I did with the Hitler biography 10 or a dozen years ago. So I agreed to do that, and at the minute that I've completed this first one of the 2 volumes to Helen Black, and the question is how to actually write a book of this sort. I decided that what I needed to do was actually to see how this drama unfolded from the eve of the First World War through to 1949. So the first 8 chapters of the book deal in chronological slabs with thematic sections on from the brink of First World War through the Great Disaster, as I called it, onto the post-war turmoil that followed. Then on the brief period of recovery where things seem to be looking up. But I call that chapter in the late 1950s Dancing on the Volcano, because beneath the surface glitter of the Charleston era, and hence in a way Dancing on the Volcano, beneath that surface glitter all sorts of problems were being stored up in Europe, which then burst out, of course, when the Depression afflicted Europe from 1930 onwards, and then we go into the story of the descent into the even worse hell of World War I and World War II, and Europe had, in that 30-year period, inflicted on itself a double catastrophe and almost destroyed the entire continent. At that point, I interrupt the narrative by having one thematic chapter which looks at a number of aspects of this history which can't be dealt with in chronological or narrative fashion at all, but things which run through the history of that period. And they include, of course, population change and socio-economic developments, but also the history of the Christian churches, a very, very checkered history in that era, and then also the question of popular entertainment in the 1920s to the through to the end of the 1940s. Before I then return to the question of the return from this hell and the absolutely amazing recovery that is already in train by 1949, and hence my decision to end the book in 1949 instead of the conventional date, perhaps 1945, because I wanted to see how Europe begins from the most unlikely starting point of utter chaos and continued violence in 1945 and 46 to bring about the essence of a recovery already visible, plainly visible by 1949, which then leads into the second volume, which I'm working on right now. And of course, description is not enough. In these chapters, what I want to do is to show how Europe descended into this hell, but also to bring to bear as much as possible as I can of eyewitness testimonies to this. So we're seeing it through the eyes of contemporaries, this descent into hell as well. But of course, that in itself is not sufficient. There has to be analysis, and I find my analytical framework in 4 elements, which I think combine to bring about this double catastrophe in Europe, and that is the explosion of ethnic nationalism that followed World War I, the border conflicts which are endemic in Central and Eastern Europe, the worst area for these things, and of course not just by chance, they're the epicenter of the terrible catastrophe that afflicted Europe in World War II. Thirdly, then, the massive accentuation of class conflict now linked to Bolshevism, the presence of Bolshevism in Russia, which at the same time as splitting the left also gave new succor to the populist right, to fascist and Nazi movements in many parts of Europe. And fourthly, a double crisis of capitalism, a massive inflationary crisis in the early 1920s, a deflationary depression crisis from 1930 onwards. And these four interlocking elements, the interlocking nature of them, which is what I stressed, that's the crucial element which then provides the backcloth to this descent into hell that reaches its low point, or its high point, whichever way you look at it, in the Second World War. Then the recovery, so I call that a matrix of catastrophe. Then I have a contrasting matrix of recovery, which provides the platform for this, what is no less than an amazing recovery after 1950. And this is then, first of all, of course, the destruction of Germany, Germany's power ambitions, great power ambitions, the absolute premise of what follows. Secondly, less obvious, the huge ethnic cleansing that took place in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, following the war, which then, along with the geopolitical reordering of the borders, provides then a new start in the most horrendous fashion imaginable. In human terms, this is utterly repulsive. In political terms, it helped to calm down that eastern half of the continent. Thirdly, then the Iron Curtain itself, the division of Europe between these two halves, which meant that the Western halves were now the national interests of the countries were largely subordinated to the superpower interests of the USA, and in the eastern part, of course, the national interests of the countries now under the yoke of Soviet communism were naturally subjected to the domination of the USSR. Fourthly, then, there's some absolutely staggering economic growth, which begins in the depths of the war itself, and it's really started to take off by 1948. Global economic growth, incidentally, so how it panned out depending on the political systems. And then fifthly, but not least, of course, nuclear weapons. And the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki left the USA only for 4 years as the sole nuclear power, because in August 1949, which is where my book ends, the Soviet Union exploded its first nuclear device, first atomic bomb, and so we now have a bipolar nuclear world. Those 5 points, again, the interlocking nature of 5 points, is really what helps to explain the great period of peace as well as prosperity that followed on the Second World War. Right now I've done 4 chapters in draft of the second volume, 1950 to the present, so you can imagine that's keeping me off the streets. Right now I have just finished the draft. It's probably the most challenging thing I've ever attempted, which is to try to make interesting to readers the early history of the common market. And anyway, at that point it can only be onwards and upwards in the next chapters. Thank you very much for listening.